You know, my role is to try to help them as best I can, but again, strictly based on the facts and good medicine. So if the facts and the medicine are against them, I can advise them. I can help them deal with that, but I can't offer them an opinion that they want to put on the stand, for instance.
And you are getting paid by the defense in this case, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, in fact, over the last 20 years, you provided opinion and testimony in one other case that I was working on, correct?
That's correct. That's about 10 years ago.
Dr. Arden, when I reached out to you in this case, what were you asked to do?
When you reached out to me for this case, I was asked to assess the injuries that Ms. Konig had and to compare them to the accounts excuse me, of how the injuries occurred and to determine the nature and severity of those injuries and whether they did or did not match the accounts for how they occurred.
Okay. In order to help you do that, did you review certain materials?
I did.
By the way, did you prepare a report in this case?
I did.
And are all the opinions that you're giving today and you gave in your report given to a reasonable degree of medical probability?
Yes, they are.
I'm going to ask you what you reviewed. Would it be helpful to see the list included in your report?
It would.
This is his report, which is Exhibit D85. May I approach, Your Honor? You may. Okay, I'm handing you D85, which is this your report, Doctor?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And is I think on one of the pages, does it have the materials you reviewed?
Yes, on page 2 of the report, it does include the list of materials I've reviewed.
Okay, could you please let the jury know what you reviewed in this case before rendering your opinions?
Yes, first of all, I reviewed various documents from the Honolulu Police Department. Those included statements and documents related to statements from a Sarah Buxbaum, an Amanda Morris, a statement of Ariel Konig. I then was also provided the transcript, the written transcript of recorded interviews of Ms. Konig. There were 4 of those at different dates. Also provided photographs of Ms. Konig and Dr. Konig and the scene and some of the evidence. And then there's a physician's report that was filled out by 2 of the physicians at the Queens Medical Center. That's actually a police document. There was also an investigation report from the prosecutor's office here. And then there were medical records for Ms. Konig, first from the Queens Medical Center, and then from her primary physician, that was the Kaiser Permanente physician. And then finally I was provided a transcript of the grand jury proceedings.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I'll just leave a report. Is it okay if I leave the report up there with him, Your Honor? Yes. All right. So, getting into your opinions in this case, Doctor, I want to ask you a few questions. You saw in the documentation and you referenced in your report that Ms. Konig had a stellate laceration to her scalp. Is that right?
That's correct.
I want to ask you some general questions about stellate scalp lacerations first and then get into the specifics of the injury, okay?
Yes, sir.
Doctor, one of the things you note in your report is that scalp lacerations are notorious for substantial bleeding. Can you explain this to the jury and why that is the case and what you mean by scalp lacerations are notorious for substantial bleeding?
Yes. To begin with, just in case terms have not been properly defined, laceration, by its very definition, is a blunt impact injury in which, by the nature of the impact, their soft tissue gets torn or split open. So a scalp laceration is therefore laceration of the scalp on the head. Now, you ask about the excessive bleeding. The scalp tissue is what we call, in medical terminology, highly vascularized.
What do you mean by that? Highly vascular.
Excuse me. That's fancy language for it has a great deal of blood supply. So, if you damage the scalp tissue, which has a great deal of blood supply, it will bleed excessively. In fact, scalp lacerations are notorious for bleeding tremendously. This is, excuse me, something that's even, for many people, common knowledge, that if you get an impact to your head, if you split open the scalp, even a small laceration tends to bleed tremendously, and sometimes it looks pretty horrific. Oh.
I know you have a cough.
Yes, thank you
so much. I'm going to hand you this water.
Thank you. My apologies. I've been fighting a sinus and bronchitis thing for a while.
Okay. Given what you just described about scalp lacerations being kind of notorious for substantial bleeding, my next question is the amount of blood from a scalp laceration a good indicator of how serious the injury medically is?
No. And in fact, that's exactly the point when I talk about excessive bleeding even from a small scalp laceration, namely that if a small one will bleed tremendously and there'll be blood on the head and running down the face and it looks horrible, to put it simply, that doesn't mean that is a serious injury. It doesn't mean that there's anything life-threatening about that injury per se. It's an artifact of the fact that those scalp lacerations are known to bleed so excessively.
Okay. For example, let's pull up S15 if we can, Mr. Dirks. This is a photograph in evidence, and you see how, doctor, there's a lot of blood. It looks horrible.
It does.
Again, in this case, when you saw the photographs, but then also reviewed the medical records and, particularly, the information provided by Dr. Grosjean and Dr. Whitney and the Queen's medical staff. In this case, after you saw the bloody photos, in your opinion, does the amount of blood in this case accurately convey how serious the injury is medically?
No, in my opinion, it definitely does not accurately convey the severity or the seriousness of that injury.
Okay, thank you. We're going to get into that a little more in a second, but generally speaking, what is a stellate laceration?
Stellate is an anatomical term that describes the configuration of certain injuries. And the word stellate means star-shaped. So you can see this with some lacerations. Just as an aside, it's not related to this case, you can see this with certain kinds of gunshot wounds where you have, instead of a very simple laceration, which will look like a line, it's a line of interruption of the tissue or splitting of the tissue. Instead of that, the stellate laceration looks star-shaped, so it will have limbs of laceration extending in multiple different directions from the center.
Okay. You had a chance to see the photographs of Ms. Konig's scalp laceration, correct?
I did.
And did you also review the available medical records that was provided by the state to us?
Yes, sir.
Now, two Queen's doctors testified and also filled out an HPD form, Honolulu Police Department form, that Ms. Konig's scalp injuries in this case did not create a substantial risk of death and did not rise to the level of serious bodily injury. Do you, after your review, doctor, in your opinion, do you agree with the Queen's doctors in that regard?
I do, very much so.
And can you please explain why you believe that her scalp injury did not create a substantial risk of death and did not rise to the level of serious bodily injury?
Well, the first question is the easier one because it's very straightforward. The scalp laceration that she had, even though it was stellate, even though it was fairly large in comparison to the front left side of her head where it was, only injured soft tissue. You think about the anatomy of the head. The scalp is basically a specialized form of skin and the tissue beneath it. Then you have the skull bone, and inside the cranial cavity formed by the skull bone you have the brain. And in her case, the medical records demonstrated quite clearly that all of the injury was to the scalp itself.
Meaning the soft tissues.
Exactly, the skin and the tissue underneath it. We all have a layer of fatty type tissue called subcutaneous tissue. Subcutaneous means under the skin. So the scalp is both of those, the skin and the subcutaneous, and that's all that was injured. The bone wasn't fractured, the brain wasn't injured, there was no bleeding around the brain, anything like that. So simply having a soft tissue injury that requires cleaning out and sewing up is not a life-threatening injury.
Okay. Next, and again, you agree with the Queen's doctors when they checked off the part about it didn't rise to the level of serious bodily injury, correct?
Right, because you'll see in that form the questions about the serious bodily injury had to do with prolonged or permanent disfigurement, prolonged or permanent loss of function of part of your body, and a soft tissue laceration, even a big one, doesn't cause any of those things.
Okay.
So it didn't rise to that level.
Now, Doctor, the Queen's doctors also both checked off the box that said she did not have a serious concussion. Did you also agree with that?
I did.
Now, Doctor, were you also asked to provide opinions as to whether Ms. Konig's injuries were consistent with what she reported?
Yes, I did arrive at such opinions.
And did you review her multiple statements given to the police to do so?
Yes, sir.
And you mentioned the grand jury and things like that, right?
Yes, I did.
Now, in those statements, you noted she reported that she was hit with a rock up to 10 times, and at times she said full blast, 100% of his power, all over her head. As an expert in the field of forensic pathology, in your opinion, were her injuries consistent with her statement that she was hit up to 10 times full blast with 100% of his power?
No, sir, they were not.
And why not?
Well, several reasons. First of all, the injury she has is largely localized. It may be stellate, but it's still largely localized. Almost all of the impact injury she has is localized to one area of the head. So it's not consistent with all over the head. Frankly, it's also not consistent with likely being up to or around 10 impacts. It's consistent with fewer impacts. And the other thing is the part of the element in your question about full blast, using all of his strength with the rock. That would very likely result in more severe injury.
Okay.
It would likely result in skull fracture. It would likely result in bleeding around the brain or brain injury itself.
Okay. Now, you indicated, not consistent with, up to or close to 10 blows. In your report, did you say that, you say in your report that your opinion is that it reflects several impacts at most. If you can explain what you meant by that.
Yes. What I intended to convey with that wording of several impacts is that, in my opinion, that stellate laceration is most consistent with being approximately 2 to 3 impacts with the rock.
Okay. So possibly 2?
Yes.
But to be fair, you indicated that looking at it, possibly could be 3, right?
Yes. My best estimate is approximately 2 to 3 as being most likely.
Okay, thank you. And that's after looking at her statement. I mean, that's actually after studying the photographs and whatnot, yes?
Correct.
In the statements that you were provided, did you see where Ms. Konig was telling the detective that her back of the head was being bashed against the ground?
Yes, she did state that.
And did you find her injuries to be consistent with that statement?
No. She had said being grabbed by the hair and having her head bashed into the ground, the back of her head. There's no description of any injury to the back of her head in the medical records, nor were there any brain injuries. There's a particular pattern of brain injuries that could occur if the moving head strikes the stationary ground, such as being bashed into the ground that way, and she didn't have any of those either.
Okay. And to be fair, I should ask you this earlier. I mean, it's a to be fair, it was a complex laceration on her scalp. Yes.
Oh, yes, sir.
Okay. Now, you mentioned in your report an injury to her eye, and I want to ask you about. You made some comments about her eye injury. Are the orbital bones around the eye thin and fragile?
Some of them are. The orbit is the eye socket, and some of the bones that form the eye socket, especially the roof of the eye socket, as we call it, those are very thin, fragile bones that can be easily broken.
Okay. All right, doctor. Have all the opinions you have given today been given to a reasonable degree of medical probability?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Gordon, cross-examination.
Yes, take just a moment to set up.
I'm sorry, I had one last question. I apologize. I meant to ask you this. I missed it. You reviewed the Queen's HPD report and from the two doctors, yes?
Yes, sir.
And do you believe generally your opinions are pretty much consistent with what the Queen's treating doctors said?
Yes, my opinions are consistent with their opinions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Whenever you're ready, Mr. Gordon.
Okay, I'll still take just a moment.
Take your time.
Dr. Arden, before I start with the questions in my cross-examination, I'm going to hand you a binder with several exhibits, including your report, your CV, the medical documents, the transcripts that you said you reviewed. So I'm going to approach you with that now, and previously shown to defense.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you turn it off? No, it's still on. Sorry, bear with me. Okay. Ready?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Good morning again, Dr. Arden.
Morning, sir.
Right. I want to follow up on a couple things, but before I get further into your opinion, can I go over some stats with you? And this is from your CV.
Sure.
You said you've been an MD since 1980, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And after you got your MD, you became a resident in anatomic pathology first, right?
Correct?
Okay. And then a resident in forensic pathology, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And then you worked full-time for the government, for various agencies in different states, as a forensic pathologist from 1984 to 2003. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
In 2004, you began to consult in forensic pathology. Is that right?
I did. Actually, to be clear, I had done some consulting work in the years before that, but that's when I began basically trying to make a full-time job out of consulting.